Hi there, my name is Dov Zeisblatt, and today I'll be talking about consumers' choices over healthy and unhealthy foods. So we'll first be looking at the neoclassical consumer theory, which essentially talks about how a consumer and delves into how a consumer seeks to obtain the best bundle of goods and services that he or she possibly can. So how does a consumer choose the optimal bundle of goods? Well, economists assume that a consumer has preferences that can be represented by a utility function. People have preferences over different things. They don't like everything equally. The utility function, what it does is it assigns a number given to a bundle of goods and services. It doesn't have an actual measurement, but the higher the number, the more desirable that bundle of goods and services is. On this diagram, we have good X1, which is good 1, and X2, which is good 2. Of course, a consumer's optimal bundle of goods and services is always going to be subject to a budget constraint. Why? Because a consumer has an income, income M, which can be seen over here, which must be, and the amount of a good 1 and good 2 which they purchase must be less than that income because you can't spend money which you don't have. The budget constraint on this diagram is shown with the gradient price of good 1 over the price of good 2, and that anything under that budget constraint is that budget set in which the consumer can afford. So different preferences in the neoclassical model. The budget is limited only in displaying the available combinations of goods and services. However, people have preferences and might prefer different combinations. No one likes apples and oranges the same and might want different amounts of each. So a few assumptions we have about preferences is that preferences are complete. No one is completely indifferent between two goods. There's going to be some preference of one good over another. Preferences are also transitive in the sense that if apples are preferred to oranges and oranges are preferred to pears, then apples are going to be preferred to pears. Preferences are convex, which will more easily be displayed on the next slide, and that there is non-satiation, so that which essentially states that 3 apples is better than 2 apples. More is always going to be better. So choice. Going back to convexity, on this diagram we can see 2 indifference curves. Indifference curves essentially give the bundles of goods and services in which a consumer is indifferent about. A and B are on the same indifference curve and but subject to the budget constraint. However, C is on a higher indifference curve, which has a higher number as we discussed before, and is a more desirable set of goods and services. It can also be seen that C is the average of A and B, which convexity implies, which is that the average of between 2 points on a convex difference curve is going to be more preferred. It's in the preferred set. It's higher up. Consumers essentially going to choose the best bundle of goods and services that they possibly can, subject to their indifference curves and the budget set. So key theories and implications from the neoclassical model are that a consumer's first concern is to maximize their personal satisfaction. Therefore, when you make a decision, a purchasing decision of 2 goods, you'll make it based on your evaluation of the utility that you'll derive from the product or the service. We also assume in the neoclassical model that people always act rationally when making these economic decisions. They'll do what is best for them, best being subjective, of course. It's also possible to make suboptimal decisions. For example, due to false perceptions, education might cause people to think that chocolate's healthier than apples. External market factors such as market failure, as well as constraints on the opportunity set. What if apples aren't as readily available as oranges, and that can also affect a person's optimal utility, obtaining the optimal utility. The next thing we'll look at is behavioral economics, which adds another dimension on top of the neoclassical consumer theory. What it essentially does is it studies the effects of the psychological, cognitive, emotional, cultural, and social factors on the decision that an individual makes in the market. We're going to compare how these decisions vary from the neoclassical consumer theory. And we'll have a look at, specifically with regard to healthy and unhealthy foods, what behavioral economics adds for us. So the key behavioral economic theory that we're going to look at is we're going to delve into the framework where a consumer doesn't use their true utility function when purchasing and eating food. Other notable ones to mention, which can also help us design policies if we're trying to encourage healthy eating, is that consumers are affected by one another as well as other external biases. However, we're going to look at mostly when a consumer doesn't use their true utility function due to what we're about to talk about. So hot and cold state decisions. What behavioral economics adds to the neoclassical model is that it considers a person's situational feelings and how they interact with their consumption. The hot state decisions are impulsive and they're led by what you desire in that very moment, which is like seeing a chocolate bar and really wanting it in that moment and deciding to buy and eat it. A colder state decision is a more rational decision considering other effects that take place. For example, if you had health issues, if you had obesity, should you really be eating that chocolate in the first place or should you be eating something better? Now, Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler have a really interesting reading which looks into this kind of behavioral economics and adds another dimension on top of it. They make a distinction that utility is comprising of split into 2 distinct parts: decision utility, which is explaining how choices are made prior to consumption and hence how they drive our decision making. Hot and cold state decisions would both fall under that. And then there's experience utility, which is really interesting in that it talks about the experience after consumption, where you evaluate your past decisions. Your experience utility occurs after you actually consume the food, looking back at what the utility actually was for you. This doesn't suggest that people don't know what they like, because people do know what they like, but they like different things at different times. And that the gap, and something that Common and Dalla interestingly mentioned, is that when the gap between purchasing and consuming food is longer, an agent's mental state and circumstances are likely to change a lot between those two different times. And they highlight that, which will help us with policy, designing a policy to ensure people eat healthier foods, is that to maximize utility, one must start by making a forecast about how the various possible outcomes will be experienced. It's important before you actually, before you want to derive utility from, for example, foods, it's important to forecast beforehand, prior to actually doing it, what the utility actually will be afterwards, your experience utility. So researchers at the Carnegie Mellon University investigated a really interesting experiment, which was about choosing a lunch meal in advance. They asked people to order lunch prior to lunch, up from as early as 7 a.m., and they found that people who chose their lunch earlier tended to pick meals with fewer calories. What we can infer from this is that they're choosing in their colder state, they're making a colder state decision and making it more rational, taking more things into account. For example, that healthier food is better for you. They also did another experiment, which was offering a free lunch after they completed the survey, and that the earlier the survey was done, the less calories people chose in their lunch. So how should we use this to inform policy design? Well, it's clear that what a consumer really wants is made in their, and is seen in their experience utility, is decided in their cold, more rational state. So then, therefore, should we design policies to determine, should we design policies that provide the opportunity to predetermine what food you want to purchase and what food you want to eat in order to make a more rational decision. This is interestingly seen in the food industry, not directly with eating food, but by Starbucks. So when they were expanding, they wanted to ensure that their customer service was still at a very high level. And what they found was that if you asked an employee prior to a busy shift what they should do in a difficult situation, they gave a better answer than what they actually did in the situation where they were losing patience with other employees and even customers. So what they did is that they produced a simple solution which they call preloaded decision making, similar to what Carmen and Dalla talked about, in that it allowed employees to plan their response with a cool mindset. So they didn't need to think as much in their hot state and risk losing their self-control. They asked employees to write down, when a customer yells at me, I will. And what that allowed the employee to do is create a cold state decision, which would end up benefiting, being beneficial for their experience utility as well. So what policies can we be designed to ensure that food consumption is chosen rationally and that people should choose healthier food more than unhealthy food? Well, first of all, it's important to say that this is necessary and that government intervention is necessary, as they have the power to enforce these rules. Because in England, 62% of adults and 28% of children are obese, leading to a higher risk of diseases like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and specific cancers. Key policies that have already been designed to prevent this are developing a consistent front of pack, emphasis on the front of pack labeling system that makes it clear what's in the food and drink. When you pick up a piece of food and you see what the calories are and all the fat, saturated sugars and salt prior to eating the food, it's more likely you'll make a better, colder state decision of what you should be eating, and you might decide, oh wait, that's actually not good for me, I'm not going to eat that. This helps to counter the hot state decisions by providing key information to change the preferences of a consumer prior to purchasing and consuming the product. Another way you can design a policy is also similar to what Starbucks did and the Carnegie experiment, also what Carmen and Dal talk about, is that you can ask a person, for example, this is in specific situations, but if they're ordering lunch, if in a workplace there's a canteen, you can ask people to order lunch prior to actually eating their food instead of choosing in that moment, so that they're making a colder, more rational decision on what's better for their health rather than an impulsive decision. So conclusions and final thoughts is that the neoclassical consumer model, it's nice in providing a foundational understanding of how a consumer chooses bundles of goods, taking into account their preferences and also their budget constraints. However, what behavioral economics does is it adds a different dimension by looking into the thought process and situational feelings of a person across different points in a timeline, specifically in what we've talked about here. By dividing utility into decision and experience utility and looking at how a consumer behaves and how their decisions are either hot or cold, we can design policies to encourage healthy eating by forcing preemptive measures to encourage the colder states decisions and counter the hot state irrational decisions. Thank you for listening. Here are the references.